Welcome to Inside ArtScroll, where the books that we read and the people that write them come to life. It's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Hillel Danziger to ArtScroll Studios. Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom.
It's not just a pleasure, it's an honor, and it's also many collective years of being a part of the greater ArtScroll mishpacha. How many years are you associated with us?
Close to 40.
About 40 years. Rabbi Danziger is here really almost like a celebration of one of the most monumental projects that ArtScroll has embarked upon, and that is the completion of the English Ein Yaakov.
Yes.
And we're going to delve into what the Ein Yaakov is. But before we even talk about what the Ein Yaakov is, Rabbi Danziger, how long were you working on this project?
5 years.
Wow, 5 years. What we'd like to do and talk a little bit about is the history of the Ein Yaakov, because it's not a new sefer, and then a little bit about the sefer itself, and maybe share with the viewers some really interesting things that I learned when I was learning about the Ein Yaakov, and by going through some of the parts of the sefer itself. So, Rabbi Danziger, talk to us a little bit about who the author was, what period of time he lived in.
Right. So the author was Rabbi Yaakov Ibn Chabiv, and he was born in 1445 in Spain, and he was one of the Spanish exiles in 1492, where he went to Portugal, which expelled its Jews only 5 years after that. He suffered a lot. His son, the Maral Bach, as a teenager, was actually forcibly baptized in Portugal. And they eventually escaped, and he moved to Salonika, which is Greece, but was under Ottoman rule for about 100 years before that. And it continued to be under Ottoman rule till the beginning of the 1900s. So it was really part of Turkey, where he was widely recognized for his scholarship, and he became a Rav, and he actually met two wealthy philanthropists, bibliophiles. Now, bibliophiles back in 1500 meant there weren't many printed works, but they had vast libraries, which he availed himself of to compose the Ein Yaakov, where he collected all the aggaditis the aim was all the aggaditis in Bavli and Yerushalmi, but he had a thematic considerations. He really only used those aggaditis which fit his thematic arrangement, 12 themes. Torah, Avodah, Gemilos Chasadim, Din, Emes, Gan Eden, Gehenim, etc., things of that nature. And he omitted the ones that didn't really fit that thematic arrangement. But he kept the arrangement of the Shas Bavli. He kept the arrangement according to each Masechta. But sometimes he rearranged some of the material for thematic consistency. But on the whole, it follows the arrangement of the Shas Bavli. And he really had proposed to write an index where to find all the Gemaras related to the themes. He had the themes subdivided into subcategories. He never lived to do that. Actually, he never lived to complete the Ein Yaakov either. He only finished through the end of Moed. The rest of it was completed by his son, Reb Levi Ibn Chabiv, who was a well-known and highly acclaimed posek as Truvis, Maral Bach. It was completed by him without access to his father's notes. And so on the second half of Ein Yaakov, we don't really have the Ein Yaakov's own work. We have the work of his son, minus also Yerushalmi on the second half, because even the first half only had the beginning of Moed. I don't believe it was complete on Moed, and it was hard to come by copies of Yerushalmi in those days. The Maral Bach sent messengers to try to find copies of Yerushalmi for him to include. It was not included. But the Rabbi Yaakov Ibn Leib did produce the first half himself, and he printed it in 1516, which was really, not that much after the advent of printing.
Very early, yeah.
Yeah, it's, incunabula, which means really the cradle of printing, is till 1500. This was 16 years later. He also composed a work called Hakosev, means the writer, the author, where he collects comments from Rishonim, many Rishonim. It's hard to say Achronim because in his days that was just the beginning of the Achronim, many earlier works, and he compiled them. And so we have that only on the first half, the part that he published. But as I mentioned, that his son did not have access to his notes for the second half, so we don't have the original Hakosev on that section. The Hakosev in and of itself is a repository of comments from Rishonim that really would not have really been known until some of them, for example, the Rashba. The Rashba, besides his Chedushim on Gemara, on Shas, wrote Perushim on aggadas. And they are quoted extensively by the Hakosev, by Yaakov Chaviv in the Ein Yaakov, and they weren't really printed as a separate work until the middle 1900s. So for hundreds of years, really the access people had to the Rashba's Perush on aggadas was really in the main from the Ein Yaakov, from the Hakosev in the Ein Yaakov.
And when you're saying that, there's a very amazing side benefit almost to the Sefer Ein Yaakov, which is that he quotes Gemaras. And if I'm not mistaken, he was considered a great expert into the actual Girsa of the Gemara itself, correct?
That is true. He had access to the manuscripts, the Spanish manuscripts, and they do, the Ein Yaakov is a repository of old Girsos, which the Dikduke Sofrim uses extensively. Even the side of the Gemara, you find many times Girsas Ein Yaakov. And it's interesting to see some of the older Girsos. The Vilna printers, this is interesting, maybe we would have made different decisions, but they decided to, quote unquote, correct the Ein Yaakov by adjusting the Girsa he had to fit the Girsa in the Vilna Shas. But they left the old reading in parentheses, and they put the new ones in brackets. When we produced our Ein Yaakov, so there was some people, the purists among us, wanted us to go with the Girsa of the Ein Yaakov. That's the older Girsa. But it was meant to be, in part, a companion volume to people who are learning Daf Yomi. And therefore, not to give them, this is not what I learned in the Gemara. The Gemara said it differently. We generally kept the Girsa in the elucidated part, as it is in the Vilna Shas, but on top of the page you have the original Ein Yaakov reading in parentheses without nakudos, and it's there for anyone who really would like to see it. It's really there on top of the page.
You mentioned previously that part of the Ein Yaakov was written by Rabbi Yaakov and part by his son, the Marabach. When you were editing it and you were learning it, do you see a stylistic difference between the way Rabbi Yaakov and his son wrote? Well,
the short answer is no, but that's because when you're reading the Gemara itself, the quotes from the Gemara, it's really, you don't have that much of the individuality of the author there. The individuality is expressed in the Hakosev, so we don't have Hakosev on the second volume.
That's true.
But the Ein Yaakov itself was, as I mentioned earlier, he really left out those Gemaras that did not fit his thematic outline. Later, about 100 or so years later, there was Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh de Modena, who wrote who wrote a sefer including all the Gemaras that the Ein Yaakov had left out. And sometime after that, in one of the Amsterdam prints, they asked his permission, and he consented, and it was incorporated into the Ein Yaakov. So really, the Ein Yaakov, as we have it today, no longer follows the thematic filtering of the author, but it has many more Gemaras too. And the Vilna printers on their own supplemented that with other Gemaras that the Habona, that he was called Habona, the Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh de Modena, who wrote a perush on the parts on the second half that he added Habona, which is in the style of Hakosev. So really now, if you look at current editions of Ein Yaakov, it's really hard to tell what was originally there, what was supplemented by the Habona, and what was supplemented by the Vilna printers. But one thing we know, everything that's there is in the Gemara or the Yerushalmi.
Fascinating. When you said about the 12 categories that he wrote on, I was wondering if that's why it was called Ein Yaakov. It
Yes.
was his name because Yaakov had 12 Shvatim.
I'm sorry. That is one of the reasons. That is the reason he said he called Ein Yaakov, because Yaakov had 12 sons. The question is really Ein Yaakov. What does the word mean?
Ein,
Yaakov.
yeah, I was
So it's a
wondering
pasuk in Mezos HaBrocha. So there's a machlokus in the Rishonim. So the Ibn Ezra and others say that Ein Yaakov means that it's like from the source of Yaakov. Like something like Mayon, something along, and Yaakov had 12 sons. Targum has that Ein Yaakov is ke'en, like the brachas that Yaakov gave his sons, which could also be a hint at the 12 sons. Interestingly, it seems that one of the primary commentaries on the Ein Yaakov is the Ein Yaakov. Rabbi Yaakov Reischer, who was in Prague, he lived, it was about 200 years after the Ein Yaakov. The Ein Yaakov was first printed, the first chelik, in 1516, and this was in about 1713. Almost 200 years later, there was an epidemic in Prague, and he was forced to leave. In those days, that's the way they dealt with epidemics. They had to just get out of the cities so that the pathogens shouldn't spread, and from person to person. And he was without his forum in exile, and he was a premier Shoel Umeshiv in Shuvas, and he focused on Shas and Poskim. And so he said he's not going to leave he was about a year and a half in exile. He's not going to, what can he do? He doesn't have his forum. So he wrote a perush on Ein Yaakov. He didn't finish it, but he wrote his perush on Ein Yaakov.
With no svarim?
I don't know. He might have had access to some. Maybe he had to take a break from his halachic writing because he didn't have access to enough svarim. It's not clear from his introduction. But it seems that he did it without access to svarim, or at least not many svarim, a remarkable perush. But there's an interesting sequel to the story. He didn't publish it. And he came back to Prague in 15 maybe, or thereabouts, but he was soon, he took a position as Rav in Worms, and then from there to Metz. And he suffered an eye ailment that made him blind. And he did a cheshbon hanefesh, and he writes in his introduction that he attributed it to having written something in a tshuva against someone who had attacked him. He said something to the effect that some militza that he should be blinded for his. And he regretted it. He says, Talmud Chacham doesn't speak that way. And he brought Gemaras that you don't say such things. And he thought that it was a punishment, so he turned blind. So he did tshuva, and he made a neder. Doesn't specify what the neder was, but he says Hashem soon sent him a doctor who was able to cure his eye ailment. And he said then he paid back his neder that he paid to Hashem in the time of his suffering, and he was going to pay ayin tachas ayin. He was going to, in place of the eyesight that Hashem gave him back, he was going to finish his perush on Ein Yaakov, which he did. So from that expression, it would seem that part of his neder might have been at the time when he was blind, that he would finish his perush on Ein Yaakov, but we're all the much more illuminated because of it, because Ein Yaakov is one of the primary perushim on Ein Yaakov.
Fascinating. Can we take a step back? The Ein Yaakov is a pirush, it's a commentary on aggadah Gemaras. And we know there's a lot of very interesting, bizarre, very strange aggadah Gemaras. Could the Rav just comment or explain, I know there's different approaches, what is aggadah? How did it make it into a work of halacha, which is what the Gemara really is, and what are we supposed to do with it?
Okay, that's a very broad question. So, the answer, I would say, you'd have to look in the introduction that we wrote to Medrash Rabbah and Ein Yaakov. And the reason in the main, I would like to refer people to that instead of going through it now, is because some of these things are very subtle, and people hear things differently. And this kind of venue does not allow to choose carefully exactly every nuance of what you say, the writing, the medium of writing and printing does. And we did, and it was very carefully done. Ultimately, people have to look at it carefully and really, I think, consult with their rebbeim to deal with whatever questions they might have on aggadah in general. It has to be done just like you find in the Gemara that Ein Darshan is Ma'aseh Merkava. You can't do it in a public setting. I hope this is a nice informal conversation between you and me, but obviously it's not. This is in the public domain, and it has to be done carefully. But broadly speaking, there's an interesting. Really, the question goes back to the Rabbi Hillel Danziger in the Kuzari, in the third Maimer around chapter 68, 69, 70, in that area. So the king expresses, as people say, like, there are such strange things in aggadah. Like, what are we to make of them? So the chaver, the rabbi says to the king, the Kuzari is a dialogue set as a debate between a rabbi and a king. Really, it was written by Rabbi Hillel Danziger. The Ramban in the Chumash attributes it to Rabbi Hillel Danziger. Some say it really was a dialogue that he just recorded several hundred years later, but the general understanding is that it was written by Rabbi Hillel Danziger. So what we have here in the Kuzari is from Rabbi Hillel Danziger. And he says, he tells the Melech, you're expressing, you're puzzled by how Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, could say such a thing. He says, do you see what they write in their, what do you say about what they write in their halachic discourses in the Talmud? He said, it is an intellectual rigor that is unmatched. He says, it's the same people who wrote the Gemaras in the Chelek HaHalacha, who said their statements in the Chelek HaAggadah. It's the same people. So you have to say that either they meant certain things that the surface meaning may not be exactly what the intended meaning is. It's couched. So this goes back all the way to Rabbi Hillel Danziger. Now, the Kuzari is speaking largely about the way they darshan psukim for halachic purposes, but it extends there to aggadah as well. So in the Hakdama to Ein Yaakov and in the Hakdama to our Medrash Rabbah, we really expand on this at length. There is an interesting Chassam Sofer. One of the main mother lodes of Aggadah is the fifth parak of Bava Basra, the Aggadahs of Rabbi Bar Chanan, and Parak Hamocher Sasfina.
And ArtScroll actually put out a separate
pamphlet, which is, I think, very well received. So in there we print at the beginning an interesting comment from the Chassam Sofer in Toras Moshe, in Parshas B'Shalach. He says on the Mechilta comments, makes a comparison between aggadah, which some say comes from nogad, to attract, it attracts people, aggadah, and the mun. So the Chassam Sofer says, just as in the case of the mun, people tasted whatever they wanted to taste. So too it is with aggadah. People see in aggadah different things, and each one is almost specific to the person who's seeing it. And the implication is that this was intended by Chazal that what they said could support various meanings, and those meanings are intended. It's sometimes it's mystical, sometimes it's inspirational, sometimes the meaning is sermonic, sometimes, and it's interesting how we have an insight. At the beginning, insights are one of our greatest contributions to the Ein Yaakov. The insights, which are drawn from a vast array of different sources, whether it's Bali Musar, Rishonim, Darshanim, Hasidic sources. It's a very eclectic array of sources. And we have an insight there which draws on this eclectic array of sources to give different ideas about aggadah and why Chazal framed it in these ways. One of them is a famous comment from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. We quote it from Reb Chaim Zaychik. He says it in Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He says at the time that the Germans in the 1800s took over parts of Europe, conquered parts of Europe, forming the German Empire, you would say the eagle had one wing in this city, the other wing in another city, and its talons were in this city. And if you look at a map of the time, you'd see exactly what they meant, that the German Empire took over these things. He says to the people that at that time, they knew right away what was meant by the metaphor of the eagle. He says today, well, sounds like there was this giant eagle that just spread over Europe. He brings from Yisrael Salanter. We bring there something also from the Radvaz. Beautiful. The Radvaz says that, of course, there are many hidden meanings, but Chazal tried, as the Rambam says already in his Akdama to Mishnayos, that many of the ideas, concepts that Chazal wanted to convey are really not for everyone. And they hid it behind this veil of aggadah, so it would not be discovered except by those who were fit to discover it. So the Radbaz says that's why Chazal sprinkled aggadahs throughout the Gemara. He says instead of having it in one place. First of all, it gives people a break from the rigors of learning halacha. Not that aggadah is not a study, but it's a different type of study.
Correct.
And also he says it's like he doesn't use the example, this is a modern example, he uses like a treasure hunt. You find a clue here, you find a clue here, you ever go into an escape room and you have to look for clues. And it says, yeah, you find a little piece of Gemara here and another piece of Gemara in a different Masechta, and you find all the different clues and you put them all together, then you'll find the key to get at it, to escape from the setting that the aggadah was put in and to arrive at the intended meaning.
This is something that on some level I'm intrigued by, because if aggadahs were supposed to cloak certain meanings, throughout history people have written, the deeper meaning, perhaps the Maharal and Chidushei Aggadas and others, and now ArtScroll comes along and kind of makes Aggadah Gemara available to the masses, which is fantastic. It's a huge benefit, and we could learn Aggadah Gemara in a meaningful way. But on some level, are they perhaps unsealing something that was meant to be sealed?
Well, the parts that were really meant to be sealed, because they're beyond us, remain sealed. We don't get into those. The parts that were unsealed by giants of our Masorah, like the Maharal, or Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, or the Rambam, or the Rashba, or any of the others, so once they unsealed those particular meanings, so that it's in the public domain, and we try to present it. I'll just mention that it seems that by collecting all the aggadahs together, the Mari ibn Leib, the Mari ibn Chabiv, the Rabbi Yaakov ibn Chabiv, sort of defeated the purpose of the Radbaz says of keeping it scattered.
It's like having all the clues in the escape room in one spot.
All the clues in the same spot.
Fantastic.
Right, but there is a very interesting there in that insight we bring down from the Munkacher Rebbe. I say, as I've mentioned, that the sources we draw on in that one are as eclectic as what appears throughout the 18-volume work. He says, he gives a mashal, a parable of a king who had treasures, and when he was due to pass on to the next world, he realized that his son was too young to appreciate the treasures. He was afraid that if his son came into possession of these treasures, then he could be exploited by advisors, and people would take it, and he would fritter it away. So he had an artisan hide them in the palace walls and paint murals over the walls with some just less than perfect paintings in certain spots. So people wondered, they looked, that's strange. We had a first-rate artist painted it. Why did he miss that corner or this corner? Okay. The son grew, and he was a connoisseur of art, and he always admired the murals. And one day, as an older and developed and sophisticated person, he looks at, 1 second here, this doesn't make any sense. how did my father, the artist who did this, how did he not do such, how did he paint such seemingly inferior things in this place? It's not the same as the others. And he had somebody break the walls at that point, and that's where he found the gems. He said his father was waiting for something. You see, if Chazal say something that doesn't seem to fit with this is what Chazal would say, that is exactly the proof that there's something special lying behind there, and that's where Chazal hid those gems.
Wonderful. That's amazing.
There is many things remain unsealed. We bring in one of our Hakdamis the Tzlach, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Landau, writes in his Hakdama to the Tzlach on Brachas. He gives also a parable of a woman who was shipwrecked on an island with other passengers. She was expecting a child, and she gave birth to a baby boy on the island. And they're on this desert, this island, and not a desert island, an island where they were just shipwrecked. And an older man comes to the boy as he gets a little older, and he says, "Let me teach you how to read." He teaches him the alphabet. And the boy is, why do I need this for? There's nothing here on the island. There were no books. There's nothing. You're giving me some needless skill. What do I have to know how to read alphabet? There's nothing here that this opens for me. He says, you're right. Nothing here on the island is going to be shown to you because you know how to read. But one day, we're going to be rescued. And you're going to be brought back to civilization. And there you're going to find libraries of treasures that will be accessible to you only if you know how to read the books that I'm teaching you now how to read. And the Rabbi Yehuda says the same thing with aggadah. Chazal are giving us the tools. Read this, learn it. You don't understand it now, that's okay. One day Hashem will open your eyes to some of them, and you'll be very thankful that Chazal gave us those tools of how to read these things which are not accessible to us as of yet.
Very interesting. Rabbi Hillel, as you were working on this monument, 5 years of dedication to coming up with some incredible, was there like one particular vart, a moment that you're like, wow, that's incredible, that's amazing, that you could share with us?
There is, but I would not like to run out of time before I mention something.
Sure. We're here to interview what you have to say. We want to hear.
Fine. Yes, thank you. The amount of material that we drew on to do our parish Ein Yaakov, the team we had working on it. You see, this is not. This is Inside ArtScroll, not Inside Ein Yaakov. For Inside Ein Yaakov, I recommend highly reading the Hakdama of Rabbi Yaakov ibn Chabiv to the Ein Yaakov. But how this was done with a huge team. We had one team who took the Gemaras, which were already translated in the Schottenstein Gemara, but it was translated in the Schottenstein Gemara as a way of studying Gemara. People learn. Ein Yaakov really aims at a different setting for learning. It's it's lighter, it's still intense in some way, but it's learning. It's learning Divrei Chazal, but it's in a more narrative setting, and therefore the translations, the elucidations of the Schottenstein Talmud had to be revised in a more narrative way to be more appealing as a read rather than a study. Just as somebody gave an example, says it's something you want to read in your armchair, not at your stender. So that had to be revised. Now we had one team of people working on that. We had another entire team of people working to find material that would be, we have certain policies of what we're looking for, inspirational, sermonic, even Hasidic, Bali Musar. And we had a team that really went through great lengths and assembled an immense amount of material. Now, I know myself, somebody says, you find some Sfarim, they say, Ayin Sham, see here. Nobody's bothering to look. He says, we had the people, whatever they found that they thought was appropriate, that might turn into an insight, an amplification on the Ein Yaakov, on the Gemara. So they print out the PDFs, they annotate which parts they thought would be most usable for us. It went from there to somebody else who reviewed it and decided what was most useful. It went from there to writers who wrote up the insights. It went from there to people who checked the insights to make sure that everything was accurate, and sometimes even again to another editor who looked it over at the end. And I would say of the amount of material submitted, not even 10% found its way into the insights.
That's incredible.
However, I said, we have done so much research. We've got so much material, even if they're not for insights. People might be interested in seeing these things. They will be interested in seeing this. We have it already. Why not make it available to the public? So we came up with a separate section called additional references, where we give 1 or 2 lines what these other pieces we didn't use say. It's not just say, Ayin Shom, see there, nobody's going to look. See there, where he says something along these lines, it might pique someone's interest. Says, oh, wait, I'm interested in following that up. So that section is a treasure trove of additional material that we had already discovered and which we incorporated. It doesn't jump out at you when you learn the Ein Yaakov, but if you look at those additional references, you'll see a vast amount of additional material. So this entire system, individually, there's no way I could have done it, even a fraction of it. But a lot of different people, we put together a team that was able to produce, as you called it, a monumental work. To get back to your question.
Sure, and we'll conclude with this.
Not that I'm avoiding it. That was the Inside ArtScroll story. I came across, reading once, something that Rav Soloveitchik, Zchrono Livracha, said on a certain Gemara in Moed Katan, Daf Chav Hei. And when I saw it, I said, this is going to have to go into the Ein Yaakov when we get to that Gemara. And it did. And it's something which you look at a Gemara and it seems there's nothing remarkable about it. It's a straightforward Gemara. And what Rav Soloveitchik did with that Gemara, he sent it into the stratosphere. The Gemara says that Rav Huna, when Rav Huna was nifter, so they couldn't get his mita, called a beer, out of B-I-E-R, out of the doorway. The doorway was too narrow. So they tried, let's take it out. There's an opening on the roof. Let's take it out of there. So I think it was Rav Chisda who said, no, Hachi Amar Mar, we don't do that. The Rav Huna said, the derech, the kvodo shel chacham, the way to honor a chacham is you have to go through the door. Okay? So you can't get it out the door. So let's move the body into a smaller mita and move that out of the door. No, Hachi Amar Mar. Also, it says, no, kvodo shel chacham is in his first bed. So they had no choice. It says they broke open the doorway and they took it out. Seems to be a Gemara that just passed right by. But the Gemara did put it in. Rav Soloveitchik said this, I imagine it was 1940. I don't know, but it was a hesped he said on Reb Chaim Moiser Grudzinski, who was nifter in 1940. And Rav Soloveitchik said, in essence, the Gemara's saying is that a great man, an Adam Gadol, is broader than most people can appreciate. That's what makes him an Adam Gadol. He said, the tendency is, when we want to have an appreciation of an Adam Gadol, so I'll leave out the part about going through the roof, that's a separate, he speaks about that, we speak about that. The tendency is to try to cut him down to our size. Let's move him into a smaller bed. He can't fit through the doorways of our minds. He's too wide. So we have to, the tendency is, move him into a smaller bed. Let's keep him. He learned B'hasmada, and he mastered this, and he memorized this, and he was kind, and he was Bal Chesed, and he says, no. Kvodo shel Chacham is b'mitaso harishayna. The cover of the Chacham is in his breadth, not in the narrow part that you can appreciate. You have no choice, but you want to appreciate who he was, you have to break open the doorways, the narrow confines of your mind, and to be able to appreciate the breadth, the vastness of what this Adam Gadol was.
That's beautiful. That's really magnificent. And I think on some level, that's what happened in your entire monumental work of Ein Yaakov. You took something which was confined, if you want to say it that, and a person would read, and maybe that's even aggadah, and you broke it open and said, broaden yourself, and you'll appreciate what's inside of the Sefer.
Yes, thank you. It's really eclectic. We're not trying to push one particular theme, one particular way of looking at things. One of our readers early on was actually critical of our insights. And he wrote me an email, and he said, it's really, you're just going over the same 6 themes over and over again. It's just, you just say it in different words, and it's just, come on, it's getting... I said, well, first of all, I didn't say this, but according to the Ein Yaakov, it would be 12, not 6. Right. Okay, all right, so we won't quibble over the numbers. I said, a huge Talmud Chacham, and I said, Rabbi so-and-so, by your way of looking at things, you could say that all the great restaurants of the world could reduce their menus to one simple card. We serve fats, carbs, and carbohydrates and proteins, seasoned to taste. There's a multi-billion dollar industry. People eat different foods. People like different things. It's true. There are many themes that are repetitive, but different things strike different people in different ways at different times. And by drawing on this vast array of sources and presenting it in this way, I think people will find things that will appeal to them and inspire them and make them better in good times, in not as good times, and at different times in their lives.
Amazing. You should have continued Hatzlacha and Siyata D'Shmaya. People should purchase this Ein Yaakov. They should learn it, be inspired by it, where they're at. And in Mirz Hashem, you should continue to disseminate such amazing Svarim and projects that really help Klal Yisrael become closer to Torah learning, one individual at a time. You should go Michael Chayil.
Amen. Thank you. So we mentioned in the Hakdama, also we bring down, it's a Sifri in Parshas Eikev that says, if you want, the Darshe Rishumos say, if you want to know, to recognize Misha Omar V'Hoya Ha'olam, learn aggadah. It says, because from there you'll get to recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to emulate his ways. It's not just about learning, it's about being. It's about becoming the type of people Chazal wanted us to become.
Beautiful. Mirz Hashem. We should have that tzchus.
Amen.
Thank you so much for coming down. This was very enlightening and also very inspiring.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.